Section 2.2 in game theory, Giacomo Bonanno. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Of the professor and author. Chapter 2.2 Strict and Weak Dominance. In this section, we define two relations on the set of strategies of a player. Before introducing the formal definition, we shall illustrate these notion with an example. The first relation is called strict dominance. Let us focus our attention on player 1. Say player 1 and select two of her strategies, say A and B. We say that A strictly dominates B for player 1 if for every possible strategy profile of the other players, strategy A of player 1 in conjunction with the strategies selected by the other players yields a payoff for player 1 which is greater than the payoff associated with strategy B in conjunction with the strategies selected by the other players. For example, consider the following two-player game where only the payoffs of player 1 are shown. On the left side, and the occupier of the column, the rows, the horizontal sets of information, we have player 1, and on the columns we have player 2. Player 1's strategy sets are capital A, capital B, capital C, and capital E, and player 2's strategy sets of capital E, capital F, and capital G. Note that this is a 4-row by 3-column grid. Player 2's not shown. In figure 2.4, a game showing only the payoffs of player 1. In this game, for player 1 strategy, capital A dominates strategy capital B. If player 2 selects capital E, then capital A in conjunction with capital E gives player 1 a payoff of 3, while capital B in conjunction with capital E gives her only a payoff of 2. If player 2 selects capital F, then capital A in conjunction with capital F gives player 1 a payoff of 2, while capital B in conjunction with capital F gives her only a payoff of 1. If player 2 selects capital G, then capital A in conjunction with capital G gives player 1 a payoff of 1, while capital B in conjunction with capital G gives her only a payoff of 0. In the game of figure 2.4, we also in the game of figure 2.4, we also have that capital A strictly dominates capital D, and capital C strictly dominates capital D. However, it is not the case that capital B strictly dominates capital D, because in conjunction with strategy capital E of player 2, capital B and capital D yield the same payoff for player 1. The second relation is called weak dominance. The definition is similar to that of strict dominance, but we replace greater than with greater than or equal to, while insisting on at least one strict inequality. A weakly dominates B for player 1 if for every possible strategy profile of the other players, strategy A of player 1 in conjunction with the strategy selected by the other players yields a payoff for player 1 which is greater than or equal to the payoff associated with the strategy B in conjunction with the strategies selected by the other players. And furthermore, there is at least one strategy profile of the other players against which strategy A gives a larger payoff to player 1 than strategy B. In the example of figure 2.4, we have that while it is not true that capital B strictly dominates capital D, it is true that capital B weakly dominates capital D. Bullet point 1, if player 2 selects capital E, then capital B in conjunction with capital E gives player 1 the same payoff as capital D in conjunction with capital E, namely 2. Bullet point 2, if player 2 selects capital F, then capital B in conjunction with capital F gives player 1 a payoff of 1, while capital D in conjunction with capital F gives her only a payoff of 0. Bullet point 3, if player 2 selects capital G, then capital B in conjunction with capital G gives player 1 the same payoff as capital D in conjunction with capital G, namely 0. In order to give the definitions in full generality, we need to introduce some notation. Recall that capital S denotes the set of strategy profiles that is an element of S, that is an element S of capital S, is an ordered list of strategies. S equals open parentheses S sub 1 through S sub n close parentheses for one for each player. We will often want to focus on one player, say player I, and view S as a pair consisting of the strategy of player I and the remaining strategies of all the other players. For example, suppose that there are 3 players and the strategy sets are as follows. Capital S sub 1 equals the set containing 3 elements A, B, and C. Capital S sub 2 equals the set with 2 elements D and E. And capital S sub 3 is the set of F and G. Then, which has the set capital S sub 3 has 2 elements F and G. Then one possible strategy profile is S equals the set of 3 elements B, D, G. Thus, S sub 1 equals B, S sub 2 equals D, and S sub 3 equals G. If we focus on, say, player 2, then we will denote by S sub minus 2 the sub-profile consisting of the strategies of the players other than 2. In this case, S sub 2, sub negative 2 equals open parentheses B, comma G, close parentheses. This gives us an alternative way of denoting S, namely as the set, the ordered pair S sub 2 and S sub negative 2. Continuing our example where S equals open parentheses B, D, G, close parentheses, commas in between those letters, letting S sub negative 2 equals open parentheses B, comma G, close parentheses. We can denote S also by open parentheses D, comma S sub negative 2, close parentheses. And we can write the result of replacing player 2's strategy D with her strategy E in S by open parentheses e comma s sub negative 2 close parentheses. Thus, open parentheses d comma s sub negative 2 close parentheses equals open parentheses b comma d comma g close parentheses, while open parentheses e comma e sub negative 2 close parentheses equals open parentheses b comma e comma g close parentheses. In general, given a player I, we denote by capital S sub negative sub I a set of strategy profiles of the players other than I that is capital S sub negative I is the Cartesian product of the strategy sets of the other players. In the above example, we have that capital S sub negative 2 equals capital S sub 1 times capital S sub 3 equals the three element set of A, B, C multiply the two element set F, G equals the set of outcomes, each given as an ordered pair, A and F, A and G, B and F, B and G, C and F, C and G. We denote an element of capital S sub negative I by S sub negative I. Definition 2.2.1. Given an ordinal game in strategic form, let I be a player and A and B two of her strategies. A, comma B is an element of capital S sub I. We say that for player I. Bullet point 1. A strictly dominates B, or B is strictly dominated by A. If in every situation, that is, no matter what the other players do, A gives player I a payoff which is greater than the payoff that B gives. Formally, for every player, S sub negative I is an element of capital S sub negative I, comma, pi sub I, open parentheses, A, comma, S sub negative I, close parentheses, is greater than pi sub I, open parentheses, B, comma, S sub negative I, close parentheses, a superscript notation, or stated in terms of rankings instead of payoffs, F of A, comma, S sub I, close parentheses, is better than F of B, comma, S sub negative I, close parentheses, for player I, for every S sub negative I is an element of S sub capital S sub negative I. Second bullet point. A weakly dominates B, or B is weakly dominated by A if in every situation A gives player I a payoff which is greater than or equal to the payoff that B gives. And furthermore, there is at least one situation where A gives the greater payoff than B. Formally, for every S sub negative I is an element of capital S sub negative I, comma, pi sub I of A, comma, S sub negative I is greater than or equal to pi sub I of B, comma, S sub negative I. And there exists an S bar sub negative I is an element of capital S sub negative I such that pi sub I of A comma S bar sub negative I is greater than pi sub I of B comma S bar sub negative I B superscript. Notation, or stated in terms of rankings, f of a comma f of a comma S sub negative I is better than or just as good as for player I. F of B comma S sub negative I. For every S sub negative I is an element of capital S sub negative I. And there exists an S bar sub negative I is an element of capital S sub negative I such that f of A comma S bar sub negative I is better than f of B comma S bar sub negative I for player I. Third bullet point. A is an element to B if in every situation A and B give player I the same payoffs. Formally, for every S sub negative I is an element of capital S sub I negative I, pi of I of A pi sub I of A comma S sub negative I equals pi sub I of B comma S sub negative I C superscript. Notation, or stated in terms of rankings, f of A comma S sub negative I is just as good as f of B comma S sub negative I for player I. For every S sub negative I is an element of capital S sub negative I. For example, in the game of figure 2.5, which reproduces figure 2.4, we have that bullet point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bullet points. The first bullet point, capital A strictly dominates capital B. Capital next bullet point, capital A and capital C are equivalent. Next, capital A strictly dominates capital D. Next, capital B is strictly dominated by capital C. Next, capital B weakly but not strictly dominates capital D. And finally, capital C strictly dominates capital D. We have the same 4 horizontal 4 rows by 3 rows graph as we've seen before. Player 2s are excluded, and for player 1, strategy set yields a 3, a 2, and a 1 for each of players capital E, capital F, and G. Strategy set B has the outcomes of 2, 1, and 0 for player 1. Strategy set C has 3, 2, 1. And strategy D for player 1 has 2, 0, and 0. Figure 2.5, copy of figure 2.4. On circle. Note that if strategy A strictly dominates strategy B, then it also satisfies the conditions for weak dominance. That is, A strictly dominates B implies A weakly dominates B. Throughout the book, the expression A weakly dominates B will be interpreted as A dominates B weakly, but not strictly. The expression A dominates B can be understood as A is better than B. The next term we define as dominant, which can be understood as best. Thus, one cannot meaningfully say A dominates because one needs to name another strategy that is dominated by A. For example, one would have to say A dominates B. On the other hand, one can meaningfully say A is dominant because it is like saying A is best, which means A is better than every other strategy.